We are going to start with a little reading, so Mark can introduce his book to you.
Yeah, first let me welcome you here to the Y. Welcome to another episode of Antiques Roadshow. We'll be pulling some old ideas out of our basement and out of our attics, and you'll have to tell us what kind of value they have now. I want to thank David for coming up just for this and busy schedule with a very popular and good, insightful book. Still touring for that. So I'm just grateful for all of you being here, and I'll get to introduce the book. And I thought the best way to do that is just to read some bits of it. The reason being that, as I say in the book, this book, which I worked on and off on for 25 years, was ended up being just a number of forays into different manifestations of what I call the will to ignorance, both in our relation to ourselves, our relation to other individuals, how it affects politics, religion, and the rest. And so this is not one of those books that announces a thesis, goes on to allegedly prove it, and then has a final chapter, what to do now, or you can too. So the only way to get a taste of it is just to dip in a bit. So I hope it'll be continuous enough to make some sense to you. Aristotle taught that all human beings want to know. Our own experience teaches us that all human beings also want not to know, sometimes fiercely so. This has always been true, but there are certain historical periods, we are living in one, when the denial of evident truths seems to be gaining the upper hand, as if some psychological bacillus were spreading by unknown means, the antidote suddenly powerless. Mesmerized crowds follow preposterous prophets, irrational rumors trigger fanatical acts, and magical thinking crowds out common sense and expertise. Now, one can always find proximate causes of such surges in the irrational, the resistance to truth, whether historical changes or new intellectual or religious currents, all promising a holiday from reality. The source lies deeper, though, in ourselves and the world itself, which takes no heed of our wishes. The world is a recalcitrant place, and there are things about it we would prefer not to have to recognize. Some are uncomfortable truths about ourselves. Those are the hardest to accept. Others are truths about outer reality that, once revealed, steal from us beliefs and feelings that we feel have somehow made our lives better or easier to live. The experience of disenchantment is as painful as it is common, and it is not surprising that a verse from an otherwise forgotten English poem became a common proverb, ignorance is bliss. We all have a basic disposition towards knowing, a way of carrying ourselves in the world as new experiences come our way. Some people are just naturally curious about how things got to be that way. They like puzzles. They like to search things out. They enjoy learning why. Others are indifferent to learning and see no particular advantage to asking questions that seem unnecessary for just carrying on. That's probably most people. And then there are people who, for whatever reason, have developed a particular antipathy towards the search for knowledge, whose inner doors are fastened tight against anything that might cast doubt on what they believe they already know. We've all met people with these basic attitudes, and we have all also fallen into moods when they emerge in ourselves. Knowing is an emotional experience, and so is resisting it. Reasons can be given for the desire to know. Reasons can also be given for constraining that desire. But apart from the clash of reasons, there's also a clash of unreasoning emotions, with the desire to defend and even cultivate our ignorance, standing as a powerful adversary to the desire to escape it. Once one learns to recognize this clash of wills, one begins to see what an important role it plays in our individual and collective lives, and especially how we think about our lives. As George Eliot put it in the epigraph to this book, it's a common sentence that knowledge is power, but who hath duly considered or set forth the power of ignorance? That power is the subject of this book. Now, there are, I think, 5 chapters to the book. The first one is our struggle over whether we want to know ourselves or not, starting with Oedipus and his struggle over whether he wants to know who his mother wife really is and who he is. There's a chapter about taboos, how they develop and how our psychological relation to them. There's a chapter about fantasies of esoteric knowledge that can do without reason or experience. And then there's a chapter about nostalgia, which represents, to my mind, a kind of collective resistance to facing the reality of the present. I'm going to read from another chapter called Lambs, which is about innocence and the idea that somehow ignorance preserves innocence. I've also chosen this chapter because it's the most pro-Jewish and anti-Christian. The scene in the Christmas creche is so familiar that it takes some effort to realize how strange it is. The exhausted parents we recognize. But who are these silk-robed and turbaned men who bow and kneel before an infant? And what about the animals who seem just as mesmerized as the visitors? Even the little lamb approaches and leans his head over the manger to get a look at the competition. We are all magi when it comes to children. Like other animals, we are hardwired to protect our young. But the subjective feelings that accompany this instinct point to something beyond the preservation of the species. How we imagine children to be turns out to be a reflection of how we imagine the world ought to be, which is what makes the death of an innocent child particularly hard to bear. A possible world, a better world, seems to have died with it. Even the death of other species young disturbs some people. They will eat beef and mutton, but wouldn't think of touching veal or lamb. It's difficult to discern in what sense grown animals are less innocent and worthy of protection than young ones, given that the latter will face the same fate as the former. One might even make a clever philosophical case that eating lamb and veal saves the animal from years of suffering in captivity. But that kind of calculation is not what such feelings are really about. They are about holding on to a world picture. The child in the cradle has no idea what a burden it already carries for us. We are inclined to saddle children with expectations that their new lives might somehow redeem our own or redeem life itself. We are always on the lookout for occasions to rejuvenate our hopes and rejuvenation, from wedding days to inauguration days. They are all opportunities to convince ourselves that this time it will be really different. When it comes to newborns, we oscillate between 2 ways of thinking about them. One is to see the child as a blank slate, knowing nothing, intuiting nothing, having neither moral nor immoral instincts or very weak ones. This can fill us with a great sense of promise and expectation as we project the child's life into the future, learning more, feeling more, discerning more. We can be hopeful about its prospects. But if we think instead of its innocence as the presence of something of infinite value, a kind of purity or moral perfection, then more melancholy thoughts will occupy us. Not because we see something dark in the infant's eyes, but because we imagine that its perfection can only be diminished over time. It's extraordinary how deeply this assumption about innocence and purity and perhaps a special insight that comes from it continues to mark our culture. Hollywood grows fat on it, producing movie after movie about visiting aliens and the children who have premonitions of their arrival. The creatures who look like stretched out infants with very large heads instill no fear in them. Grown-ups in such movies are portrayed as oblivious or resistant, their age and experience having closed their minds. Except, of course, for the one exceptional adult who has never really grown up, Richard Dreyfuss. Another sort of adult, one in need of redemption, also appears regularly in children's books like Heidi, the 19th century Swiss story that remains a perennial favorite and has spawned many imitators. In these stories, an innocent, preferably dimpled little girl is put into a care of a gruff old man. The adult treats her abysmally at first, but little by little he is transformed by the child's relentless, not to say tiresome, good cheer and good deeds. The cherub turns her cheek this way and that until the man begins to see how cruel he has been, but even more how he has darkened his own life. How? By refusing to look on the sunny side. The story ends with a tearful embrace between the innocent child and the now healed adult. And why not? If the Messiah came as a child, why shouldn't the psychotherapist? Millions of adults around the world call themselves Christians. But can a Christian be an adult? I think that's a fair question to ask. Innocent lambs and children get more than their due in the Gospels, but we learn next to nothing about adult life. Christ first appears in the world as a child, yet a precocious one with nothing to learn and no capacities in need of development. Mary says hardly a word. Joseph doesn't speak at all, a very interesting omission. As for the disciples, we're told very little about their lives, not even about the extraordinary Judas, who seems to have strayed in from the Old Testament. Jesus does not prepare his disciples for the burdens of adulthood in their families and communities. Instead, he admonishes them, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple." Good disciples drop their nets and follow without asking. What their wives and children eat that night, we are not told. The early Christians were an apocalyptic sect that expected the Redeemer to return in their lifetime, so it didn't make much sense for them to plan for their future or that of their children. But the longer Christ's return was delayed, the more they had to accustom themselves to living in a world they thought they were just passing through. Discipleship turned out to be more complicated than preserving their innocence by imitating a lamb or being reborn as a child. It required a knowledge of life, of human nature, of political necessity. But their new scriptures did not confer this knowledge on them. Simple believers looked to the Gospels, then to the world, and the world looked as simple as they were. Love your enemies. If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Take therefore no thought for the morrow shall take thought for the things of itself. In the Greek and also Hebrew tradition, it's taken for granted that there is no prospect of perpetual peace on earth. Given the nature of human beings and their societies, conflict is inevitable in political affairs, genuine interests clash, power corrupts, ideology inebriates, and force and deception employed by the unjust must be met with force and deception by the just. There are wolves out there. It's been claimed that by refusing to accept this tragic vision complacently, the Christian moral revolution shifted the balance in favor of protecting innocent lambs, whose well-being must be our first concern, even in war, and that's true. But it also bred the illusion that shepherds could afford to be innocents too, which was very good news for the wolves. Let me just give the last word to James Baldwin. This comes from his novel Giovannis Room. Perhaps everybody has a Garden of Eden, I don't know, but they've scarcely seen their garden before they see the flaming sword. Then perhaps life only offers the choice of remembering the garden or forgetting it, either or. It takes strength to remember. It takes another kind of strength to forget. It takes a hero to do both. People who remember court madness through pain, the pain of the perpetually recurring death of their innocence. People who forget court another kind of madness, the madness of the denial of pain and the hatred of innocence. And the world is mostly divided between the madmen who remember and the madmen who forget. Heroes are rare. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, that is a good sampling of the book in a short time. Now, you had mentioned that you had been working on and off in the book for 25 years. And yet when anybody introduces the book, as just now, they say it's very timely. So does it feel timely to you? Does this moment tie it to our current moment? Does it feel, are what you're writing about eternal human traits or problems, or is there something about this moment that actually makes this book illuminating?
Yeah, I have to struggle a bit. I mean, people quickly jump to the conclusion, oh, it's so timely, but I have to struggle a bit with them sometimes to help them see that I'm trying to point to some eternal psychodynamics and social dynamics that are always hidden there. And they're very present right now. And we all have our view of who's wearing a black hat and who's wearing a white hat. But it's not there just out of the blue. That from ancient times, people have been thinking about what it's like to struggle to know yourself, the tragedy in that, the tension in that. We're weird creatures. We set up taboos, and then the first thing we want to do is break through a door that says, do not enter, right? And so we do want to know, we don't want to know. We're nostalgic for the past. So these things, I can bring them into the present and talk about particular manifestations now, but I hope the lasting value of the book, if there is one, is to point people to these depths.
Okay. Let me take Aristotle's side just to see what you might say. And so you quoted the famous passage from Aristotle, all men desire to know, which is like a classic Aristotle line. He drops bombs on you with great self-confidence. And I would say, if I look back on humanity, that strikes me as mostly true, even 80% true. And so I've always been haunted by Homo erectus comes along, not quite a direct ancestor of us, but sort of a human-like, in 1.9 million years ago. It's got a brain about 60% of ours, so not particularly smart. And yet it travels from over many generations, from Kenya up through the Middle East, out across India, Asia, Nepal, China, and down into Indonesia. Now that strikes me as kind of amazing, that these creatures without rest stops or tolls or roads traveled from Kenya to Indonesia. And that strikes me that there's some innate desire to explore. And then when you look, say, 15th century, Europeans, 16th century, out of greed, but also a desire to explore, Magellan sets off and goes all the way around the world. And then when he gets to Polynesia, or whoever the Europeans who got to Polynesia first, they find these people who are scattered on these islands, separated by hundreds of miles of ocean, and they've got no compasses, but they explored. They sailed across, and if you're off by 1 degree, you miss your island and you're sunk. Then you look at children, 3-year-olds ask 200 questions an hour. And then you look at teenagers. You go to any stairway with a railing, there's some teenager trying to teach himself to skateboard and falling on his ass half the time. And then finally, I visited my father in he lives in a senior community, and at dinner I was sitting next to some old guy, 100 years old. And what amazed me about that guy, he was in the middle of 4 books, he was going to lectures, all the drives that most of us have for fame, status, money, sex, those have probably all gone away. But the desire to learn was still there in that guy. And so I guess just to challenge you, I would say the amazing thing about humans is not the desire not to know, but the incredible desire to know. And that not knowing is real, obviously, but not the main event.
Well, as I say in the book, we have these 2 wills, right? There's the will to know and there's the will not to know. Let's first get out of the way instrumental desire to know, right? We face something in our environment we need to master that harms us or frightens us. We need to figure out how to do something, and we do, right? I give an example of someone who manages to fix his toaster because he's looked up all these videos and figured out things about physics, and every morning now he gets to have toast and self-satisfaction. So yeah, there's an instrumental will to know there. There's also an instrumental will not to know. There are very good reasons why we don't ask people too many questions sometimes. We don't want to know everything about the previous partners of the people we're with, and for a very good reason. And there are all sorts of other things like that. So if we get out of the way these instrumental drives, then we have to ask, so what's left? And I still think that it's a toss-up between these 2 wills, to know and not know, because you can imagine if the will to know were not there, we would have done this a whole lot faster than we did, right? But take, for example, taboo. It may be the fundamental building block of not living in the state of nature, but living together. That there are some things you can and can't do just because. This is clean, this is dirty, this is the hierarchy, and so on, that keeps people glued together and prevents them from asking too many questions, right? And we keep reinventing taboos, right? We're in the business in this country of celebrating every time we break a taboo while we're building one over there about something else, right? So, sure, you can tell a kind of story like that, Hariri story, but you just have to look at some of the writers of the Enlightenment, look at Voltaire, look at Montaigne, and they'll tell you a very different story of the mistakes we make, the cruelties that arise from our will to ignorance, and especially our inability to live with uncertainty. I think that's what's fundamental. It's not so much that everyone's walking around certain, is that the greatest human cognitive achievement is to say maybe. No other creature does that, right? And so we have trouble with that. And so partly for that reason, we shuttle between these two.
Yeah, there's Leonardo da Vinci, who was like the most curious human on the face of the earth. He has he's walking by a cave somewhere in Italy, and he says, I saw this cave, and I was torn by these two forces. Intense fear that the cave might be scary and dangerous and dark, intense curiosity that it may contain wonders. And there you see the two. But he was the kind of guy who overcame his fears. And desire is always in tension with some sort of fear. And so are there people, and I think of George Orwell, who are really good at overcoming the fear or the intolerance of ambiguity? George Orwell famously had the ability to face unpleasant truths.
Yeah.
And so he was a man on the left. He was constantly critiquing the left because, oh, this is really unpleasant for my friends. And he would go right there. So are there some people who, well, A, is it always a virtue to be on the side of leaning toward knowledge? And B, are there some people who are just better at it? Or can one make oneself better at it?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the reasons why the will to ignorance, one reason why it seems prominent in our time to me, is that we've seen a lot of the results of our curiosity, and they're not pleasant, right?
What do you mean by that?
Well, everything from the atom bomb to what we've done to our cities. Our kids are walking around alone with cell phones, technological advances. People know more about when they're going to die, but they can't control that, so they live with that anxiety, unable or unwilling to live with fate anymore, because we have this fantasy of ourselves as mastering nature, this Baconian idea. We're going to go out and master nature. And, we've seen the monsters, in Goya-like, right? The monsters that get born of these things. So that's to bear in mind. But the original question was what? I'm sorry.
Whether some people are better, can one train oneself, or is it always a virtue to be on the side of knowing?
I do think it is, but I'm one of those people, right? Yeah. And so I have arguments for this, but they only have weight with people who accept arguments. So we're already the same sort of people, right? But I've spent a lot of time these past years reading and teaching Montaigne. And those of you who haven't just picked up the essays and sort of plunged in just any old essay and read it are really missing something. And it's a training for a certain kind of living. And the first thing he does, what he wants to do, is essentially lop off our heads. And he's writing in the middle of the religious wars in Bordeaux. He's watching people being cut to pieces in the public square, thrown into deep wells, poisoning the water. He's seen terrible things. And all over disputes over theology, rational theology. The theologians who say they have a rational explanation of how we get from God down to religious and political authority and so on. And we're stuffed with all kinds of false knowledge or non-knowledge that we take to be knowledge, false opinion. And the first thing we have to do is clear that out, right? Kierkegaard once said that there are two ways to starve a person. One is to not give them food. The other is to stuff so much in their mouths they can't swallow anything. And so the first thing he wants to do is take the food out of our mouths, get us back in touch with our bodies, and to help us recognize how uncertain any of our knowledge is, to be modest about that, but to look into things with playfulness and joy, and otherwise leave things in God's hands. And so it's a kind of ethic of mindedness. And you don't find that in many thinkers or in many proponents today of Homo erectus that you're talking about.
I used to teach a course where we read Samuel Johnson and Montaigne back to back. And Samuel Johnson, they were both, in my view, big knowers. Samuel Johnson was earnest, and he thought he had weaknesses like envy and sloth, and he'd write these essays sort of out of a sense of earnest moral improvement, and it was dogged, I was going to become a better person. And Montaigne is like, I'm good. And one of my students said, oh, I get it, so Montaigne is like a West Coast rapper, like Snoop Dogg. Johnson's like an East Coast rapper, like Biggie. So like one of them is really harsh and one is soft. But Montaigne was, his observation of himself are without precedent. So he did seek self-knowledge, wouldn't you say, to an extreme degree.
Johnson?
No, Montaigne.
Montaigne. Oh, of course. Yeah. Because the one thing you could do was know a lot about yourself, right? And it's only on the basis of that, both knowledge of one's very self, but also knowledge of the human self in general, that you can understand what we can and can't do. And so it all begins with that. But to put yourself really under the discipline of questioning your capacity for knowledge, you end up, I think, very skeptical of your capacities. There's this tension in Plato between this guy named Socrates, who's constantly telling us to limit our claims to knowledge, and some guy named Plato who has these ideas of climbing up to the stars and to absolute knowledge. But it's Socrates and Montaigne that I think provide us a path to continue our search to knowledge chastened.
Yeah. Let me raise two topical contemporary issues to get your reaction. And I got these both from an essay you may have seen. Damon Linker, a mutual acquaintance of ours, sure, who teaches at Penn, wrote a Substack about your book. And the first one was the observation that a lot of people, especially progressives, think Trump supporters are often influenced by misinformation, by some malevolent, dishonest actor out there from Russia or whatever. But Damon makes the point that in your book it's less about misinformation than on misinformation, if you want to put it that way. It's not like somebody's manipulating us. We are naturally inclined to avoid the truth.
Right.
And it was, when you think about the contemporary debate, how does that strike you?
Oh yeah, people are writing about this now, how we silo ourselves, and the Kahneman book about all these tricks we play with ourselves, thinking fast and thinking slow, and the way we mislead ourselves. There's a lot of thinking about that, but I only met Kahneman once, and I was telling him that I was working on a book that would be a kind of psychoanalytic companion to his, right? Which is his is about sort of decision theory. But there's all these passions and other things that are going on behind it. No, I think it's fair what he was talking about. I also think, I don't want to leave the impression that, or let me use an example of people who are searching for knowledge endlessly while hiding something deep from themselves. I spent 7 years of my life as a Catholic Pentecostal in a prayer community where all we read was the Bible. I had a t-shirt, Property of Jesus. I had a leather cross, hence my resentment of Christianity you may have picked up. And I lived within the Bible for 7 years of my life. And if you go to the Protestant church, or evangelical church, you've been to them, what do you see? You see people there with their Bibles on their laps, and they're all colored in, right? And they've got stickums to it. They've been reading this book and writing things in the margin. So true, so true. Giving God a book review, And so their search for knowledge, though, is based on a mistake of what they can possibly know about the divine, or they aren't willing to engage in reflection about that. So you can see a lot of activity. And you do see a lot of activity on the, other side, you might say, right? There's all kind of, pseudo-learning you can obtain online. But unless you know the art of argument, unless you know how to smell the difference between a good argument and a bad one, or know when you have to step back and ask a deeper question, you're lost.
Yeah. Now, so first I've got to ask you how old you were those 7 years.
Oh, the usual years, 13 to 20.
Okay. And so you were encased within a closed system.
Yeah.
And then, well, what happened? You became a professor.
Yeah. I'm thinking of writing a book on conversions. I'm thinking of writing a book about the very idea of getting a new life. What is a life such that one can get a new one when you think about it that way, right? And so everyone who has a conversion experience, who comes out of it, also tends to gravitate towards a moment in telling the story. So deconversion stories are often really similar because you say, this was the moment. I mean, I can point to a moment where everything fell apart while looking at the Bible. I'd had an argument with someone in this new prayer community, this huge 10,000 people in the University of Michigan, and someone wanted to prove to me by scripture that women were subordinate to men. And he gave me a list of passages, and I sat down on a Saturday, went through the passages, and I looked and I said, well, he's right about the Bible, but I know he's not right. But it didn't happen that way, of course. It happens gradually. And but what I've been left with, and pointing me in the direction that I've gone in, I suppose, is, and especially feeding into this book, is that, I've had kind of three lives, so to speak. My very short little life before conversion, and then this life after conversion, this life after deconversion. And if you convert once, you can make a story about that. You convert twice, and you start wondering what's wrong with you. And why you were gravitating towards these things. And the importance of being earnest. Lady Bucknell is grilling the young man, I forget his name, and he says that he lost both his parents, and she said, young man, to lose one parent is a tragedy. To lose two parents begins to sound like carelessness. And so I had to think about my carelessness, and my carelessness in commitment and in belief. And that set me on a skeptical path.
Okay. I have to ask this question because I'm curious, so I have a desire to know. So you were in probably a simple, fundamental version of Christianity. You deconvert, and then you come across Augustine, or Pascal, or Kierkegaard, or Reinhold Niebuhr. These are grown-up Christians.
Yeah.
And did the thrill ever come back? But so that Jesus does say, "Be like a child," but Reinhold Niebuhr was not like a child. Like he was a man of complicated, very realistic foreign policy.
Without a doubt. I mean, I just did a seminar on Pascal, and I've taught Augustine before. And Niebuhr is the inspiration for part of the book, because it was Niebuhr who was lecturing other Christians about their simple-mindedness when it came to foreign policy, right? That there are wolves out there, and therefore you'll have to use deception and all the rest. And so he was critical of a certain Christian Pauline tradition, and his great hero is Augustine, right? Who thought deeply about the differences between the city of God and the city of man. But no, I swim in those waters, but we live in a culture, we live in a post-Christian culture where we've retained all the bad things about primitive Christianity and very few of the good things, right? Yeah. And one of them is just this mindlessness, this belief that somehow, Hollywood people complain about the Trumpians and their ignorance and all the rest, and they think they know everything. But what does Hollywood produce? They produce movies in which there's an organization when something terrible has happened, but there's one guy. There's one guy, right? He doesn't know finance, he doesn't know anything else, but he somehow figures out what's going on, right? And no one will believe him. And the sign that he's right is that no one will believe him. That's what makes the movie go, right? And so if you go out in American society and people gang up on you, you're kind of encouraged to think of yourself as a pioneer. You know, the next Homo sapiens going to another island. We have a kind of cult of ignorance and innocence that comes without beauty, without nuance, without spiritual depth. And that's all that's left to us.
Oh, that's uplifting. When Barack Obama was a senator, he gave a speech on foreign policy, and I said, "Did you ever read Reinhold Niebuhr?" And he said, "Yeah, he's my favorite philosopher." And then he did a perfect summary of Niebuhrian thought, and I put it in a column, and at that moment, 600 dissertations were born. Is there a million? But I've got to ask you, and we'll take questions from the floor in a minute, but I've got to ask you about, you talk about this moment of ignorance. You teach at a university which is under some assault, and many universities are under this kind of assault, not quite as bad as Columbia, but how do you think universities should respond to this moment? Or what do you think of this moment in academic history?
Yeah. Well, the reaction, the glee expressed by our vice president in tearing down the universities, that kind of ignorant, macho desire to tear up everything good and fine, that also produced him, or partially. I'm not sure what to do. And also, I'm talking to people at Columbia about what to do, and so I'm also in the game a little bit, so I can't fully divulge my thoughts about this yet, because they're also just not fully formed. I'm trying to learn. But while this is an utter disaster that must be resisted by every means possible, I do understand the sentiment that something was off. Let me give you an example. The core curriculum at Columbia runs for 2 years. In the first year, you read literature from Homer down to some contemporary novelists. The second year, it's kind of Plato to Nietzsche with a few things added on at the end in political thought. And that is meant to be the foundation for you to take other classes, and the teachers can assume you've read all these books, right? And the history of this is quite old, and there always was a sense of what the classics were that has got somewhat lost. But a couple years ago, the faculty that teaches the second year took Edmund Burke off the syllabus, the only work of conservatism. They added weeks about environmental justice or something else, a topic in its own right. And I'm thinking, Italian style here, for the past 40 years, the greatest force with the greatest energy in our country has been from the right. If you want to understand this country, you have to begin by trying to understand today sort of what the etiology was, right, of all this. Also, you would need to understand something about these forces elsewhere, not just here. Try to understand Orban, Modi, Erdogan, the manipulation of religious feeling and all those things. These are, the great deep events that are happening in our time. You wouldn't learn a thing, you wouldn't learn how to think about any of this by taking the course. And there's not a single prominent conservative at Columbia. Not true at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and...
they each have one.
No, but they have institutes where they cultivate people, even Stanford. But it's the kind of blinders about the country and the prejudices and the self-reference needs opening up. This is not the way to do it at all, but the way we've been doing business has contributed to this for sure.
Yeah, well, I didn't go into the academy because I was a Burkean, a conservative.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to be the only one at some campus because those people tend to get bitter. Let me ask you, this is also about Columbia. There have been various, you probably know him, Anthony Kronman, who was dean of the Yale Law School. He wrote a book called Education's End. And he said the universities got...
Oh, this is at Yale.
Yeah,
I do know him, yeah.
Universities have gone through various regimes. And they started out with the pious regime. They were religious institutions. Then what he calls the humanistic idea, which was about the salvation of soul, but through secular literature, really, in the 19th century. Then there was the research ideal, which was our job as universities is to advance knowledge through specialized disciplines. And then there was what you might call the professional ideal. Our job is to just help kids find jobs. And those two ideals, the latter two, created a moral vacuum into which the social justice ideal fell, that our job as activists is to improve society, help the marginalized. And I was teaching in Chicago last spring, and one of the things that shocked me, frankly, you could think what you want about the encampments, but several faculty members held their classes within the encampments. So the students had to sit there, even if they agreed or disagreed, which seemed to me such a violation of just basic academic ethics.
Sure.
But as an outsider, we all hear anecdotes about this and that happening, let's say at Columbia. But how much is the social ideal really prevailing at Columbia, or just a few people? Or like, one of the things that happens, especially frankly with the Trump administration, they take anecdote and turn it into generalization.
Sure.
So what's the real situation on the ground there?
Yeah, well, I'll just begin with the story I was telling you when we came out. I was once invited to speak at a student group about religion and politics with a minister I'd never heard of named Tim Keller, who was an evangelical minister of the old school, very modern, out of Wheaton College, I think. Very modern.
Bucknell.
Oh, Bucknell, yeah. And so popular, he had 2 churches here in Manhattan. And I expected to do the usual thing. The kids take you to a grotty Greek restaurant, check. They then take you to a classroom with maybe there are 6 people there, but you showing up helps them get funding and so on. The usual thing. Instead, we are taken to the largest auditorium, Roone Arledge Auditorium at Columbia, which has, I don't know, hundreds of seats, packed to the gills, people in all the aisles. We had to make our way up, and they were there for Keller. And we had a very good talk about these things. And afterwards, I talked to the students, and they all belonged to something called Veritas Forum, which is ecumenical religious. And half of them were Asian. They were all, almost all, in STEM fields, socially conservative. You never hear from them. No one knows that they're there. Faculty, humanities faculty don't know they're there. Trump administration doesn't know they're there, right? And when you add to that those who are just on a professional track, you add the professional schools, you're left with a few disgruntled people in a few humanities departments. And it's worse at some places than it is at others. It's worse at Columbia. And there's a reason for that. I was once, to compare Columbia to Chicago, these are 2 universities whose DNA was changed by the presence of a single thinker. At Chicago was Leo Strauss, and at Columbia it was Edward Said. And what I mean by DNA is that there are people there who speak Strauss and Said and they don't even know it, right? The difference between the 2 is that the fundamental passion at Chicago from Strauss is curiosity, And the fundamental passion of Columbia is resentment. And that permeates, right? How you change your DNA, I don't know.
Yeah. This is from a man who left Chicago to go to Columbia.
Yeah.
I've got one final question on the book. Maybe somebody could bring me our cards here. So you have early days of 23andMe, I take the saliva test, get my DNA results, and online they claim, it was a false claim, but they claim to give you your odds of suffering various diseases, Alzheimer's.
Right.
And they have a whole series of screens. Do you want to know if you're going to get Alzheimer's? Yes. Or what are the odds? Are you sure? Yes. I'm like, yes, all the time. I want to know. And so that's just me. But do most people want to know if the odds of getting Alzheimer's? And then to add, you have a section in the book where people know the day they're going to die, where you have a society where everybody knows the day they're going to die. Even I would stop at that one. Sure. But where do you think most people are, or if it's not too personal, where are you on these sorts of approaches to knowledge?
Oh yeah, no. I'm willing to let fate take care of these things, and which means preparing yourself every day. That it might be your last day, not to be overly conscious of it. But interestingly, James Watson, who was one of the first to unfurl the DNA, I don't know if you know this, but he refused to let his DNA be published, and he demanded that he not be told what the result on one gene was because he knew it was associated with Alzheimer's. And there was Alzheimer's in his family. He didn't want to know. Yeah. That's the wise path.
Okay. So we've got some questions, and it turns out there are a lot of epistemologists in the room. Is the opposite of ignorance education, or is it something else?
Well, education is a process. It's a process to produce knowledge. Now, ignorance is not the contrary of knowledge. Ignorance is a psychological state to be in. It's to believe that something is true or that something doesn't exist, and it turns out not to be the case. So the opposite of ignorance would be having thought things through, and through education, by other means, going through the work of reaching a certain degree of certainty about something.
Okay. Now this is a very good question. How much of our political problem is because of ignorance, or is it more so just malice, or some combination of the two? Can you talk about politics knowledge generally? And so some people, their default position is that people are generally well-motivated, but they're stupid. Other people think people are ill-motivated. And that's their default consciousness. How do you think about that?
Well, I think that one thing that ignorance does is it opens the hatch and lets a lot of beasts out that otherwise wouldn't be there inside of us, right? So that there are virtual and real acts of malice today that I would bet my life never would have happened had the internet never been invented, right? Because we have these things, and this is a machine to open all that up, right? And I don't know how we put that genie in the bottle, but that's another reason to be somewhat skeptical of our pursuit of knowledge as well, what we've done to ourselves there.
How do you think about the internet in terms of education, knowledge, and misinformation? Force for good, force for evil, things to worry about?
I once told my daughter I was going to take a vow that after 60 I would no longer speak about the internet and pretend to know anything about it. It's so many things. I think Jonathan Haidt, who is a psychology professor at NYU, has done a huge public service by writing a book. I forget the title. Do you remember?
The Anxious Generation.
The Anxious Generation, which is emboldening institutions and parents to take their phones away from their kids when they're young. And it needed to be a kind of a spur to collective action, right? Because you can't just do it yourself because other parents and all the rest. But, the point of knowledge is to attain wisdom. And we gain a lot of information from the internet. We may gain a lot of knowledge. It's an impediment to wisdom. That's for sure.
Okay. The question is, how much of knowledge is subjective versus objective? And just to build on that, some people in the sciences think their knowledge is subjective and you're in the humanities and your knowledge is subjective. Is that true?
No. It depends what we mean by truth. If we mean by truth what is the case, then either things are the case or they are not the case. It's an objective matter. How we feel about it. Now, the opposite of that kind of objective knowledge is not subjective knowledge, it's false opinion. Right? So, what would we mean by subjective knowledge? Well, there, if you get into particle physics and you're talking about perspective or time space and looking at reality from one and the other, you can see how certain statements can be true, and then from the other direction would not be true. But what is true is me telling you this, right? So there still is something that is the case there. So people need to drop the term subjective knowledge, and certainly I've got my own knowledge, or knowledge as you don't.
No. How do you approach ignorant people in the public sphere? Because I'm a teacher, or perhaps because I'm this way, and that's what drew me to teaching, I enjoy fishing. I enjoy casting my line out and catching somebody, and then working through an argument with them, and going step by step. And also, I love the psychological play of reading somebody, right? You know, or is this someone who basically is just indifferent to learning new things, not hostile to it, but just not thought about these things? Or is this someone for whom the relation to knowledge has really gone bad and is in this position of resentment? And then you have to learn how to read those people and figure out whether they're reachable or not. And if they are reachable, it may be different with different people. But you learn at a certain point that there are people who are unreachable. There are just as there are students who are unteachable. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I would put our current president in that category, maybe.
Sure.
But the Damon Linker piece, and we'll end on this. He mentioned something which I found persuasive, and it's in reference to your book and a political event, which was the Biden in his final year in the first term.
Yeah.
And he does this debate performance that reveals a level of decline that the American public had not seen before. And the question is, the staff that's been working with him every day, are they aware of his decline or how badly that debate is going to go, and they're just hiding it? Or have they not given themselves permission to have this thought?
Yeah. Well, even if they were to some extent hiding it consciously, the way these things work is that you read out things that don't comport with your view of someone. You know, my kid's great. You know, there's nothing wrong with my kid. And yes, you know, he's just been arrested for the 4th time, but basically this is a good kid. But there's a reason why we stick to our opinions that's good, even in the face of conflicting evidence. And that is, were we to change our opinion with each new data point, we couldn't get on with our lives because we would constantly be shifting, right? And it pays, rationally, to stick to an opinion and ride with it for a while and then see if it's right. And what was extraordinary about this moment with Biden is not only were the people who worked for him, but the press corps was sort of lost in this echo chamber about these things at the same time that they're complaining about the blindness to Trump and so on. it was very, very evident. I remember the first time he opened his mouth at the debate, and I looked at my wife, and, you know, he hadn't been seeing the press. We hadn't seen that. And it was obvious. But to see the cover-ups, not cover-ups, but later the rationalizations, it's extraordinary how these things get a grip on our mind and how selective our vision becomes.
Yeah. I certainly have spoken to some of the people in his inner circle, and they claim they did not know. And I think they're being sincere. I just think they weren't going to, that reality was too unpleasant to face, so
Yeah, sure.
we have tremendous ability to avoid those things. Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Lilla.
Thank you, David.